Então, eu agradeço a todos que vieram aqui. O professor Ben Bradford, que pode ser chamado de Bradford, ele não gosta, mas bem. Ele é professor no departamento de Criminologia da Universidade de Oxford. Ele está aqui na USP durante essa semana, ele e o professor Jonathan Jackson, que está ali a convite do Núcleo de Estudos da Violência da USP. A gente está discutindo alguns resultados de pesquisa nossos e a gente achou que seria legal separar um tempo na agenda deles para fazer esses encontros públicos também. Então, o tema que vai ser discutido aqui hoje é uma parte da gama de pesquisas dos temas que eles abordam, né, são ligados principalmente à questão da legitimidade da polícia e de instituições de segurança e justiça. Aqui hoje ele vai falar principalmente sobre resultados de um estudo feito na Inglaterra, sobre o apoio ao uso da força pela polícia. Mas existem outras pesquisas deles com relação tanto a como a população vê a polícia, como quanto os próprios policiais se veem no exercício das suas atividades. Bom, acho que a gente vai ter uma apresentação de acho que meia hora, 40 minutos, e depois disso a gente vai abrir para a participação do público, e aí vocês fiquem à vontade para fazer perguntas. Ok?
Thanks, Arnie. And thanks very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's usually a really bad idea to start off a talk with apologies, but I'm going to do that. I have two preemptive apologies to make. First is I'm on the fourth leg of an insane round-the-world trip, and I've got really bad jet lag, and I'm not sure what time or day of the week it is. So if I fall asleep halfway through, that will explain that. And the second thing is I'm aware that when I get going, I speak really quite fast. So if I am speaking too fast, please stop me and tell me to slow down and tell me to repeat whatever it is I've just said, because I can't say it in Portuguese. I'm really sorry. It's terrible. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this topic. Public support for violent policing, legitimacy, social identity and acceptance of the use of force. Actually, I want to talk about a broader set of things around this theme as well. I don't really know how long you're expecting me to talk for. We didn't really talk about that. About 45 minutes?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I'm going to do these things. We're talking about police use of force. We need to have a quick think about the power of the police, what that means, or what the police power is, and how we can conceptualise that. So I'm going to start with that. And then I'm going to introduce the idea that the empirical legitimacy of the police, the legitimacy of the police among the policed. So this notion that we as individuals and as members of social groups legitimise or not the police. And this is an empirical notion of legitimacy that's separate to and distinct from a normative notion of legitimacy. And that's quite an important distinction. I'll probably come back to that. And I'm going to suggest that the empirical legitimacy of the police, or the processes that sustain the empirical legitimacy of the police, both act as a constraint on the power of the police. They both put a set of boundaries around the things the police can and can't do, but also that the empirical legitimacy of the police, and particularly the processes that produce that legitimacy, can also act as an enabler of police power. So legitimacy enables the police to do things that they might otherwise not be able to do. And in that part of the presentation, that's where I'll really introduce and bang on about the idea of the role of social identity in this. So primarily the extent to which people identify or not with the police as the representative of a social group they find important. Then I'll come on to thinking about what predicts acceptance of police use of force. So when do people think it's okay for the police to use force to solve problems? How we want to conceptualise that. And then I'll finish with some implications right at the end. The other kind of, not really apology, just I'm going to say this, this is all based around a primarily Anglo-Saxon, particularly British way of thinking about these things, as will become very clear to you during the talk. It's not to say I don't think this has got relevance in other contexts, but obviously context is going to affect the way that the processes I'm going to talk about play out. So they're going to play out in different ways in different countries. So we might want to think, of course, about how some of these things play out within Brazil, which is exactly what we've been thinking about. I mean, the project that we're kind of helping. I'm not sure how much help we're being on it, but anyway, meant to be helping on. So what do we mean when we're talking about police power? There's a number of ways to think about, we can conceptualise and think about the power that the police have and the police power. itself. And one that I'm particularly drawn to at the moment comes from the work of Marcus Dirk Dubber, who's actually a kind of a legal philosopher in a sense. He develops a kind of a pre-19th century or an 18th century concept of police, which is in some senses much broader than what we tend to think about police now, i.e. uniformed state actors. And he's talking about the concept of police is much more to do with good governance, regulation, the reproduction of order, the reproduction of social norms, and the enforcement of social norms, and the promotion of happiness, actually. So this is a notion of police that you'll find, for example, in the work of Adam Smith. This is a notion of police that would look familiar to people operating in 18th century Paris and Berlin. But a lot of his ideas, I think, apply to the uniform state police as we think of them today, the people we actually think of the police in the kind of 21st century world. And he makes the argument that police, so the effort of the state to reproduce normative social order, is in some principle sense, or is in principle, limitless. The power to police has no bounds because the state has the ability to do whatever it thinks necessary to maintain the order that it thinks is necessary for good governance and reproduction of society over time. So he claims that the police, conceptualised as he says it, is a potentially limitless, uncontrollable, extra-legal, and that's important, extra-legal power to do what is necessary to monitor, control and reproduce good order in a particular social context. Of course, what good order means is going to vary from context to context, but the police are the tool of the state, the police are the aspect of the state that enables it to engage in that process. And we could have, of course, I think, particularly think about the extent to which police are always engaged in monitoring and controlling marginal populations and actually in identifying those populations as well. So in some sense, you could make the argument that the police power is unbounded because the state can do anything it wishes to maintain the version of good order that it thinks is appropriate. This means, and this is where I think this idea is really relevant to the idea of the police that we're used to working with, that it's very difficult to constrain the power of the police. It can be very difficult to make the police do the things that you want them to do. It can be very difficult to stop the police doing the things that you don't want them to do. Lots of ways of thinking about why that is. One of the ways we're familiar with is thinking about police activity as a classically high discretion, low visibility. So police officers in lots of different contexts, but obviously primarily I'm talking about the UK, have a huge amount of discretion about how they apply the law, whether they choose to apply the law, whether they choose extra-legal solutions to the problems that they're confronting in their work, and they do this in low visibility environments. They're usually doing it outside of any formal process or structure of control because there's 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 officers out on the street, their supervisors out there, their senior managers aren't there, no one else is watching apart from the people involved in the situation, etc. So if I was a lawyer, I'd say the best way to control the police is through the law. So we just set up a set of laws and rules and regulations that should govern the police. We enforce those rules and laws and regulations, and that's the way we constrain and corral the power the police have. And of course the law has to have some role here, particularly in a liberal democracy. I'm not saying the law is irrelevant, but I think there's a huge amount in the kind of literature around policing to suggest that the law is at best an imperfect and probably a highly problematic way to try and control the power of the police. Just because, for no other reason than police officers get to decide whether they apply the law or not in a particular context. You can't use the law to constrain and control the power of the police in the way that we want that power to be constrained and controlled, because it's potentially limitless. So Dixon says this very nicely. He says that attempts to regulate by precise rules, regulate the police by precise rules, find that the innumerability of potential situations exhaust rule-making capacity. So he's making the point there that the kind of problems, the kind of issues, the kind of circumstances the police deal with are so wide and so varied, we could never come up with a set of rules and regulations that could properly govern those. We always have to rely on the discretion of police officers in the final analysis. So what alternative sources can we have to constrain or corral this power of the police? If the law is not up to the job, what can we draw on? Well, one set of things I think we can draw on and increasingly will be drawing on in the future is the visibility of the police. We can just make police activity more visible than it's previously been. We can put, if you like, the glare of publicity onto the types of things that the police are doing, and this will affect their behaviour. and be more likely to bring their behaviour back within acceptable boundaries. So we could think about body-worn video. This is a big thing in the UK. We've imported it from the US. Police officers wearing video cameras that record the encounters they have with members of the public must affect their behaviour to some extent. The idea that someone else can come back and look at this recording in the future. Probably more importantly, we could think about social media and the explosion of the internet and the fact that everyone now has a camera on their phone and can record what police are doing in public spaces. So we could turn the glare of visibility of publicity on the police, and that would be a way of constraining and corralling their behaviour. We could affect or think about or try to influence the motivations of individual police officers. And I think in the final analysis, that's going to be the most important source of constraint on this potentially limitless power. The kind of things that police officers want and are motivated to do. And if they want and are motivated to do the right thing, we've got a suitable set of constraints around the power. Fortunately, they're not often motivated. They're relatively often not motivated to do the right thing. They're relatively often motivated to do the wrong thing, however you want to conceptualise what that is. And what I want to concentrate on today, as a constraint of police power, in the first part of the talk, is processes that generate legitimacy. Processes that make the police legitimate in the eyes of the people they are policing. And the argument here would basically be a really simple one, that the police, like any institution, require legitimacy both to effectively function at any given point in time and to reproduce themselves as organisations in the long run. State institutions such as the police, organisations such as particular police organisations, if they didn't command some level of legitimacy in a country such as the UK, would collapse in the medium to long term. So the argument would be here that this means because these organisations are relying on legitimacy, they're motivated, not least for reasons of self-interest, they're motivated to engage in practices that make them legitimate in the eyes of those they police, and these practices place a set of constraints or controls around their power, place a set of constraints or controls around the things that they're able to do. So the argument here would be something like this. This is an amalgam of a work of a number of people: John, myself, Tom Tyler, Tony Bottoms, Justin Tanqueray, John Marc Quacco, I think his name is, a French legal political scientist. And the basic argument here would be that if you're thinking about the legitimacy of the police in the eyes of the police and the eyes of the policed, you can think about that as a dialogue. So one way you can think about that is the police are continually engaged in a process of making claims about their legitimacy, making claims that they are legitimate. Those claims are received and processed by members of the public, the people they police. The way that members of the public reflect those claims back to the police establishes legitimacy within that relationship, or it doesn't. So the police may be making one set of claims about their legitimacy, that they are legitimate. The public may disbelieve those claims. They may be the wrong claims to be making to that particular public. And the public in that case will reflect back a legitimate relationship with the police, and you won't have legitimacy within that relationship. But when you do have legitimacy in the relationship between police and public, the argument would be, based on all the work that's been going on in this area for a long period of time, that legitimacy secures cooperation and compliance, so people cooperate and comply with police organisations they find to be legitimate. Legitimacy tames power. It's kind of what I'm interested in to do. Places a set of boundaries around the power of the police. And legitimacy reduces tension between power holders and subordinates, reduces tension between police officers and subordinates, people, the members of the public. Why does it do that? Well, why would we want to say that legitimacy tames the power of the police? Well, why we want to say that in a context such as the United Kingdom is because there's a huge amount of empirical work out there that suggests the most important driver, if you like, of the legitimacy of the police among the policed is perceptions or experiences of the procedural fairness of police activity. So when people perceive the police to be procedurally fair, which means to be treating people with dignity and respect, communicating openly with people, explaining their decisions, acting fairly and neutrally, making decisions based not on bias but on the evidence in front of them. When people feel that the police behave in that way, they feel that the police are procedurally just. This sense of procedural justice motivates trust and legitimacy in the organisation. So basically the claim here is that people are sensitive to the way that power is exercised, and people want power to be exercised in a fair way. And when they perceive that power is being exercised in a fair way, they're motivated to legitimise the organisation that's behaving in that way. And of course the reverse is also true. So when people perceive that power is being exercised in an unfair way, they withdraw legitimacy from that organisation. They don't have a legitimate relationship with it, if you want to put it in those terms. So we think about procedural justice as the most important driver of police legitimacy in a country such as the UK. We're talking about voice, neutrality, treatment with respect and dignity, and displaying trustworthy motives. When these things are present, legitimacy tends to be present as well. So I'm going to introduce some data that addresses some of these issues as I go through the talk. This comes from a survey fielded in 7 European countries in 2015 as part of a project called the Fiducia Project, one of these big cross-national comparative projects that people are so keen on. The primary purpose for designing the survey was consideration of predictors of compliance with new crimes, such as online fraud and stuff. I'm not going to talk about that today. What I'm going to talk about is some of the other interesting questions we snuck into the survey that address the issues I'm interested in. I'm going to concentrate primarily on the UK sample, which was about 1,000 people, although I will talk about some of the other countries as well as I'm going through. The other countries were, let me get this right, Italy, Germany, Lithuania, Finland, Bulgaria, somewhere else. I'll come on to that in a minute. Quite a wide spread of countries, isn't it? So how do we measure legitimacy in this particular context? Legitimacy has proven to be and has classically been one of these terrible social science concepts that no one can agree on what it means, how to measure it, what it does, etc., etc. So for purposes of today, I'm just going to fix what I mean by legitimacy. You may disagree, but this is what I mean by legitimacy for the purposes of this talk. So we asked people a set of questions in the survey. We think those questions tap in to the extent to which they hold police legitimate. So we think it's a psychological state that exists in people's minds. We think that that psychological state has two components. First component is what we call duty to obey. So the police are legitimate to a particular person, in part when and to the extent that particular person feels that they have a moral duty to obey the instructions of police officers. So we tap into that with questions in the survey. For example, to what extent do you feel it is your moral duty to back the decisions made by the police because the police are legitimate authorities? Back the decisions made by the police even when you disagree with them. So that's what I mean by duty to obey. This is a state that exists in people's minds that we're tapping into with these survey questions. We think that legitimacy also has another, and I think probably more important component, which we can characterise as something called normative alignment. So this we tap into with questions such as, to what extent do you agree or disagree with each of the following statements about the police in the UK? They usually act in ways that are consistent with my own ideas of right and wrong. They can be trusted to make the right decisions. They stand up for values that are important to people like me. We almost always find in the UK that questions like this load onto one underlying factor, which we can call normative alignment. Questions like this load onto another distinct underlying factor or construct, which we can call duty to obey. These two things are correlated with each other, but they don't collapse down into each other. They're two separate components of people's understanding about the police and their relationship to the police. And when people score highly on these questions, when they agree with them, we say the police are legitimate. When they score low on these questions, when they disagree with them, we say the police are illegitimate to that individual person in the survey. And we find incredibly strong correlations between these measures of legitimacy and procedural justice. This is just a simple pairwise correlation. For those of you who care about such things, the R-square value is 0.67. So we can predict 2/3 of the variation in normative alignment with the police just by knowing how procedurally fair someone thinks they are. Similar strength of correlation between procedural justice and duty to obey. The R-squared is smaller, regression coefficient is larger, whatever. These two things are also strongly correlated. This is the kind of evidence we kind of present to make the claim that the legitimacy of police in a context such as the United Kingdom is really heavily predicted on the extent to which people think they're fair. When people think they're fair, they think they're legitimate. When people think they're unfair, people think they're illegitimate. And that's really the core argument in terms of we want to make around the argument that legitimacy constrains the power of the police. Because the legitimacy is so strongly founded on perceptions of fairness, if police consistently behave in an unfair way, in the end people are going to withdraw legitimacy from the police. When people withdraw legitimacy from the police, if nothing else, the future of that particular organisation is in doubt. If lots and lots of people just aren't doing what police officers tell them to do, that organisation can no longer function effectively, and probably some significant reform process would be put in play. And if you wanted to make this really mundane, lots and lots of people would lose their jobs as a result of that major reform process. So police activity that's viewed as unfair or inappropriate will, in the short or medium or long term, at some point, undermine legitimacy. So there's a need to secure legitimacy, therefore limits or constrains the power of the police because they can't just do what they want. Because if they continue to just do what they want, people will withdraw legitimacy and lots of bad things will happen to that organisation. That would be the argument. But we'd want to place some careful boundaries around that argument. There's some really significant provisos in what I just said. For example, police in the United Kingdom often do behave in unfair ways, often do behave in ways that you would think would undermine their legitimacy among the police, yet it doesn't seem to have much an effect. They kind of get away with it, if you like. I think you can make the claim as well that legitimacy serves as a reservoir of support for the police. It's based on kind of Easton's concept of diffuse support. So when people think the police are legitimate, for example, they may be motivated to discount individual acts of unfairness because they hold the organisation as a whole to be unfair. I'll come back to that point in a minute. Some people, we don't know how many, but some, may actually value unfair policing against denigrated outgroups. So within the United Kingdom, we might want to make the claim that, for example, a significant proportion of the population like the police being unfair against, for example, gypsies, Roma and traveller people. They want the police to be fair against people who are not like them. That may very well be going on. And also I think it's important to note, I'm not going to talk much about this, the police have lots of other sources of legitimacy that bypass questions of procedural fairness. They actually bypass anything the police do at all. So these things are going to be in play as well. So we've got the idea that legitimacy, or at least the processes that produce legitimacy, constrain the power of the police. We want to be careful about that because there's probably lots of other things going on. And I think we'd also want to argue that some of those processes might enable the police to use their power in unfair ways, in ways that we don't want them to behave. I'll give an example of why I think these ideas are relevant. And this is the history of British policing. So there's a two-minute hiatus when I talk to you about the history of British policing. And when people are thinking about the history of British policing in the last 50, 60 years, there are two narratives in relation to the legitimacy of the British police over that period. The first is a narrative of decline, the second is a narrative of resilience. The narrative of decline goes something like, well, in the 1950s and 60s, we had this described as a halcyon period of British policing, when the British police commanded legitimacy. I think one leading author says to the maximum degree it's possible for a police organisation to command legitimacy among those it police. And there's some empirical evidence that this is true. So, for example, there was a survey conducted in 1960, and in that survey, 92% of people said they had a great deal of respect for the police. 96% of people said that the British police were the best police in the world. Just incredibly high levels of public support for this institution. And then the narrative decline says that since that period, what's happened is the legitimacy of the police has dropped and dropped and dropped and dropped. So we reach the present day period where the legitimacy of the police is kind of fractured, it's contingent, it's contested, and it's disappeared among certain sections of the population. Now, I think that narrative has got a lot going for it, and it's certainly got a lot going for it in terms of thinking about the absence of legitimacy within particular communities, within particular sections of the population. But the other narrative would say that actually police legitimacy hasn't declined nearly as much as it should have done, according to the first idea. So despite the kind of problematic history of police in the United Kingdom over the last 50 years, which, like police in many other countries around the world, is a history of corruption, is a history of violence, is a history of abuse of power, is a history of, for example, fitting people up, etc., etc. Police do all that stuff in the United Kingdom, and all that kind of stuff regularly gets revealed in public. Yet, despite that history, the legitimacy of the police remain one of the most legitimate state institutions. So despite them behaving in ways that should have undermined their legitimacy over the last 50 or 60 years, they remain one of the more trusted, one of the more legitimate public institutions. And I've got a kind of snapshot measure of this. This is based on some work that John and I and some colleagues did for our book a couple of years ago. And this tracks public opinion of the police and media reporting in London over a 2.5 year period. The dotted line is the intensity of media reporting about the police. I won't bore you too much, just to note that these two peaks, peak here, I've got my pointer, I can use my pointer. Where is it? So the peak here is a corruption scandal around the chief of the London police at the time, who was revealed to be engaged in, what by world standards is fairly low levels of corruption, but nevertheless corruption. This here is when the police killed an unarmed, innocent bystander at a protest. Arguably by mistake, arguably not by mistake, nevertheless he was innocent, he wasn't doing anything wrong, and they killed him. So we've got two peaks around corruption, around police use of force resulting in a death. The solid black line is a measure of overall trust and confidence in the police over the same period. So the police were getting stuff really quite catastrophically wrong, and on at least two occasions, public opinion barely but nudged over that opinion. So what seemed to be unfair, corrupt, very possibly illegal police activity didn't feed through to changes in public opinion of the police, some overall measure of legitimacy of the police, if you want to call it that. And that's the puzzle, right? The police regularly engage in activities that should undermine their legitimacy, and yet that doesn't occur. So that's what I want to talk about for the rest of the presentation. And what I want to suggest is actually something really quite specific, but I think which taps into some wider themes as well. And that's that the social psychological processes that link fair treatment to legitimacy and onto various outcomes, cooperation, compliance, the kind of good stuff that are meant to flow from legitimacy, such as support for police actions, may correlate with some rather problematic is perhaps not the right word, but I'll say it anyway, some rather problematic aspects of public opinion as it surrounds this institution. And I think it's also possible, and we'll come on to look at this in more detail, that legitimacy promotes support for an authority, in this case the police, that might be blind to the moral or ethical content of the behaviour of that authority. In other words, when you grant authority to, in this case the police, that makes you less attuned, possibly more willing to ignore particular activities that that authority or institution engages in because you grant them legitimacy. You're just less ready to accept, if you like, that they behave in legitimacy undermining ways. And also I want to suggest that procedural fairness and legitimacy, which are group level process, and I'll say about what that means in a minute, may be associated with other directed forms of support for the police. In other words, people may support the police in acting against people they see not to be like them. And that is support for the police action against people they perceive to not be like them, may actually include unfair, unjust, illegal, immoral police practices in relation to those outgroups. Why is that important? Well, why might some of those things happen? I think the reason why the reason I want to concentrate on, there's lots of other reasons as well, but the reasons why I think those things might happen in the relationship between police and public revolves around the place, if you like, of social identity in procedural justice theory, this idea that procedural justice motivates the legitimacy of police, based most importantly on Tom Tyler's work. And on this account, or on several accounts, one of the reasons, possibly the main reason, why people are so attuned to the fairness of police activity, one reason that people react so strongly to police activity they find to be fair or unfair, and one reason why procedural justice, procedural fairness, is linked to legitimacy is because the police represent a social group that people feel they belong to, that they identify with. When police officers interact with them, those police officers are communicating to those people their status, their inclusion, whether they belong, whether they're valued by this social group and by the police as representatives on this group. So when you feel fairly treated by the police, you feel included, you feel like you belong, you feel you have status in the group the police represent. When you feel unfairly treated by the police, you feel you're pushed out, you feel you're excluded, you feel you don't belong. And this kind of process of social identification with the group and with the police motivates legitimacy, because we're motivated to legitimise authorities of groups to which we feel we belong. And it also probably motivates compliance behaviour. So we're motivated to follow the rules or the laws of groups to which we feel we belong. And of course the reverse is true. So when police officers treat someone unfairly, they push them out, they exclude them, they denigrate them. We're not motivated to legitimise authorities of groups we think are excluding us, to which we don't belong. And we're not motivated to follow the rules of groups which we feel are pushing us out in some important sense. I think it's also important to note that social identity is not the only thing that links procedural justice to legitimacy. There's also an evaluative process in action here, almost undoubtedly, well, definitely. So you can make the argument, I think, that procedural fairness indicates to people that the police are operating according to appropriate moral standards. So when police treat people fairly, they think the police are doing the right thing. And when they think the police are doing the right thing, this enhances the legitimacy of the police, and vice versa. All these associations are bidirectional. But I'm going to concentrate on this process here. This makes particular sense in the United Kingdom. This idea that the police represent a social group to which most people feel they belong, want to belong to, value, etc., etc. Because we have a long history in the United Kingdom of associating or linking the police with dominant notions of nation, state, and community. These images are very familiar to British people in some general sense. So this is a police officer standing outside number 10 Downing Street. So the police directly associated with the centre of the nation state. The idea that police are your neighbours, that makes sense to people in Britain. They get what that means, the idea that police can be your neighbours and you can have a neighbourly relationship with police officers. These kind of images, this is a famous TV character from the 50s and 60s, these kind of resonate with people today. The police are associated with the nation state, I think, in some broad sense, a community of belonging. Of course, there are other images of police. So police are always polysemic. They represent different things to different people. So significant numbers of people, police represent things like this. Police represent denigration. They represent a group to which people feel they don't belong, to which people feel they're being excluded from. But nevertheless, I think these kind of dominant themes that the police represent the nation, the state, a community of belonging, if you want, resonate with really significant sections of the population. So we want to kind of conceptualise, or at least think about what this identity might be, and that's quite tough, actually, because the police are polysemic and they represent different identities to different people in time. But we tend to ask questions like this. We're thinking about this identity that may be enhanced or undermined by the way that the police behave in relation to people. So we ask people, how important is each of the things to how you see yourself? Being British, being a law-abiding citizen. And now thinking in terms of how you would like others to see you, how important is being British, being a law-abiding citizen? Now, this is a purely subjective identity. We're not asking people to prove they're British. It's difficult even to say what that means, actually, in Britain at the present point in time. We're definitely not asking people to prove they're law-abiding citizens, because they almost undoubtedly aren't, right? But they feel these things about themselves. They feel that they're British. They feel that they're law-abiding citizens. And actually, quite interestingly, all these answers to all these 4 questions will load on one underlying construct. So it's something about kind of being a British, law-abiding citizen. Whether that's important to people or not, well, we kind of think it is because we asked the question. And we find that our identity correlates quite highly with people's opinions of the police. So in a general sense, the more procedurally fair you think the police are, the more strongly you identify as a law-abiding British citizen, whatever that means. The less procedurally fair you think the police are, the less strongly you identify as a law-abiding British citizen. Now, the direction of causality is entirely unclear here, right? It's likely to be both. But I'm not trying to make that point. I'm just trying to make that these things are associated in people's minds. And actually, interestingly, this law-abiding British citizen is associated really quite strongly with people's legitimacy judgments. So the stronger you identify as a law-abiding citizen of this particular nation state, the more normatively aligned you feel with police, and in particular, I think more interestingly, the more you feel you have a duty to obey the instructions of police officers. So again, we can explain about a third of the variation in people's perceived duty to obey the police just by knowing how strongly or how weakly they identify as a law-abiding British citizen. That's a pretty strong pairwise correlation. And interestingly, we find these in all the other countries we did in the survey. So yeah, it was Turkey, Germany, Italy, UK, Bulgaria, Finland, and Lithuania. In all those, and obviously the question varied by country. It wasn't British citizens, it was Polish citizens, German citizens, etc. But in all those countries, there was a significant and positive correlation between perceptions of the fairness of the police and strength of affiliation with that identifier. And in pretty much all those countries, there was 2 variations out of the 14 pairwise correlations. In almost all those countries, there were significant and relatively strong associations between legitimacy judgments and identity judgments. So across 7 different countries, the more strongly you identified as a law-abiding citizen, the more legitimacy you granted to the police, and vice versa. So, which brings me on to my example of police force, and the reason for that little diversion will become clear in a minute, I think. The police use of force is obviously a really, really interesting way into thinking about the way that police power is constrained and enabled, in this case, by legitimacy. I think the ability of police to use force to solve problems, enforce their will, is in some sense a defining feature of the police. That is in some sense what it is to be a police officer, to be given the ability to legally use force to solve problems. In some ideal typical sense, this isn't true in reality, but in some ideal typical sense, only the police have this power. That's not actually true, but you get what I'm trying to say. there's a number of different ways of thinking what, for example, appropriate force might be, which is obviously relevant to the discussion today. The College of Policing, which is the organisation that has various forms of governance over policing in England and Wales. So the England and Wales, we've got jurisdictional anarchy in the United Kingdom. So it's one country, it's two countries, and it's arguably four countries, depending on how you count it. College of Policing do England and Wales. They talk about reasonable and proportional use of force. They don't talk about minimum use of force. So in the UK, the lay perception of the ability of the police to use force revolves around minimum use of force. That's not where the police officers think about it. It's reasonable and proportionate use of force to solve problems. And they actually have fairly strict guidelines about the kind of force they can use, when they can use it, etc., etc. Whether they obey those guidelines, of course, is another question. And force must be absolutely necessary for a purpose permitted by law, in theory. But of course, there are many examples of police use of force which don't live up to those standards, which have been perceived as unfair, as illegitimate, and may, in some specific sense, and may, in some general sense, have undermined the legitimacy of the relationship between police and public. But of course, the key point I want to make today is that people also support police use of force. People like the police using force in particular circumstances. So again, we've got this idea that the use of force could undermine legitimacy, could also promote legitimacy. It's going to be related to people's perceptions about the acceptability of the use of force are going to be related to their legitimacy judgments. These are some relatively famous uses. Don't know why it's done that. This is some fairly famous recent uses of police force in the UK. Pales in insignificance, right, from the context that you're used to thinking about. But some of these was really big stuff, big deals in England. This is the guy who was killed by the police in 2009 when we saw the peak on the previous chart. This police officer here is just about to push him. He falls to the floor and then dies as a result of the injuries very soon afterwards. Mark Duggan is the young black man who was shot by the police in 2011, and that led to the riots in 2011 we had across the UK. I don't know if any of you have heard of that. That was a big deal for us. We had lots and lots of riots. We weren't really expecting this. The reason I put these up here is I think almost everyone would accept that in some sense this was unreasonable use of force. That's a bit more difficult. I can talk a bit more about that in questions if you want. This is the more standard use of police force at demonstrations. So English Defence League is a kind of far-right street fighting group we have at the moment. The Countryside Alliance was a march related to country issues, doesn't matter, in 2002. This is where most people see police using force to control demonstrators, to keep the crowd back, to keep people in order doing demonstrations, etc., etc. And this is often the kind of use of force that people find acceptable. People want the police to control demonstrations. They want demonstrations to go off peacefully, and they want the police to be able to use force to control demonstrators as and when they think that's necessary. I'll come back to one of those later on. So, why might people support police use of force? When might people think that the police use of force is acceptable or unacceptable? So they might think that police use of force is necessary in the fight against crime or for particular justifiable ends. It's kind of what the police think about it as well. Police think that they should use force when and to the extent that it enables them to achieve some legal or legitimate ends. They think they should use force when it helps them in their fight against crime, which is what they think they're doing. Some people are going to support police use of force because they're authoritarian people and they like firm authority. They like people getting beaten up every so often because it demonstrates and reproduces hierarchies in society. Some people might support police use of force because it's engaged or directed against people who aren't like them, as I mentioned before. I think some people, and this is really the key point I want to talk about today, some people find the police use of force acceptable when they identify with the police and legitimise the police, and when they think the police organisation is worthy of their support in some way. So, if we're arguing that legitimacy and or legitimacy-sustaining processes are linked to potentially problematic public support for police action, in other words, the argument here would be that sometimes police use of force is acceptable and appropriate, sometimes police use of force is prima facie unacceptable, inappropriate, but there may be something about the legitimate relationship between police and public that motivates people to support police use of force that seems inappropriate, that seems unacceptable. It is inappropriate. It is unacceptable. So the argument might be here, for example, that legitimacy crowds out moral judgments around particular acts. So in other words, when you grant legitimacy to an organisation, you grant to that organisation the power to determine what is right behaviour. You believe that what it's doing is right regardless of what it is it's actually doing. Your own moral judgment becomes less important in that particular point in time. Police action and other social processes that motivate identification with the police and identification with the social group the police represent may influence the judgments people make in relation to police behaviour when that behaviour is directed towards denigrated outgroups, when that behaviour is directed to people who aren't members of this group, which I remember I'm specifying as the law-abiding British citizen, whatever that might be. So one relevant other here may be offenders. So it may be, for example, that the extent to which people identify as law-abiding citizens affects, colours, changes the way that they think police use, the judgments they make rather about the acceptability of police use of force when that use of force is directed against offenders who are definitely not law-abiding British citizens by definition because they're offenders. This is the way that people might think about these things. So these are the ideas one attests. Of course, it's important to say that it plainly goes both ways. So judgments about the acceptability of the use of force are going to shape legitimacy. Legitimacy and or legitimacy sustaining processes are going to affect judgments about the acceptability of the use of force. There's going to be it's a reciprocal relationship. So I'm just going to impose one particular causal ordering, which is the bottom one, but the other one is going to be in play as well. And this is going to develop in some kind of iterative sense over time. We've just got a snapshot here, so we can't model these processes of change. So we asked people in the survey about support or their judgments about the acceptability of the police use of force. So we asked them, some people think it is right to use violence to achieve different aims, while others think the use of violence is always wrong. How acceptable is it for a police officer to do each of the following? Use deadly force against a person who is armed and believed to pose a threat to other people's lives. 60% of respondents said that was very acceptable. It's a 4-point response scale here. Very acceptable, fairly acceptable, I think, not very acceptable, not at all acceptable, something like that. How acceptable is it for a police to strike a citizen who uses his fist to attack the policeman? And how we got away with that? 38% said that was very acceptable. The key point here is these seem prima facie legitimate uses of force. It seems like this might be an appropriate point in time to use force when someone is armed and believed to pose a threat to other people. We also asked how acceptable is it for police to use physical force against an offender who is handcuffed and in police custody. And 56% said not at all acceptable. Good, right? Doesn't seem like an acceptable use of force. Some people did think that was acceptable. Some people thought that was okay for the police to do that. And finally, use force to arrest an unarmed person who is not offering violent resistance. 69% said not at all acceptable. But again, some people thought that was okay as well. So we've got two questions that seem prima facie acceptable use of force, fairly high levels of support. We've got two questions that seem prima facie unacceptable uses of force. Some people were prepared to say that these were acceptable as well. And we've got variation. So people were given different answers to these questions. What helps us explain that variation? We tested 4 factors, 3 of which are going to be very familiar with you. Citizen identity, duty to obey as one component of legitimacy, normative alignment as another component of legitimacy, and as some general measure of political affiliation, we had a kind of classic left-right scale. So on a scale of, I think, a 7-point scale, are you very left-wing over to very right-wing? And we found that across all 4 individual scenarios, vignettes, whatever you want to call them, more strongly you identified as a law-abiding British citizen, the more acceptable you thought it was for the police to use force in that scenario. So whether the use of force seems justifiable or seemed unjustifiable, the stronger you identified with the group the police represent, the more ready you were to find acceptable police use of force against an offender. All these individuals have been identified as offenders. Duty to obey, no significant association with any item. I find that reassuring. Normative alignment, which I claimed I think is the most important component of legitimacy. This is where it starts getting really interesting. So normative alignment is positively associated with support for police use of force when it seems appropriate. So when the use of force was against someone who posed a deadly threat, when it was used against someone who was hitting another citizen, the more legitimacy you granted to the police, the more ready you were to find that use of force appropriate or acceptable. But that component of legitimacy, in fact, neither component of legitimacy had any association with what seemed like the unjustified use of force. So the more legitimacy you granted to the police didn't seem to promote greater acceptance of what seemed like unjustified police use of force. And we found some kind of vague, these are much weaker associations between where you are on the political scale and support for the police. I mean, so it is the more right-wing you are, the more right you are to support police use of force. But these associations were much, much weaker than these. This was by far the dominant factor of these four predicting support for police use of force. So when you identified more strongly with the group the police represent, you're motivated, you're encouraged for whatever reason to find it, to judge acceptable, to justify police use of force across all those four different scenarios. So why might that be? Well, I've already touched on these, but I think it's worth rehashing them. I think strong identification with the group the police represent motivates support for the police as group authorities against out-group members, against people who have been defined, not least by the police themselves, which is where it starts to get really interesting, but by people who have been defined as not members of that group. They're not law-abiding citizens, they're offenders. It could be, and I think this is likely as well, that strong identification and perhaps high legitimacy, but again, strong identification, just crowds out sceptical views. So psychologists would talk about unity of impression. So we're motivated to have a unified impression of a particular organisation. We find it difficult to hold divergent or conflicting views about, in this case, a particular organisation. So when we identify strongly with it, we're just motivated to believe the things it does are right, because it's cognitively difficult for us to motivate with it strongly, identify with it strongly, and believe it's doing the wrong thing in some way. So it kind of has a crowding out effect. I think it's also possibly, indeed likely, that identification and perhaps legitimacy act as uncertainty reduction mechanisms. So in the absence of full information, which we didn't give people, they provide heuristics on which people can base their judgments. So I think one way to think about these questions would be to think about the way that people read and process newspaper headlines. So when people read a newspaper headline about police beating someone up, acting in a violent way, whatever it happens to be, if they identify strongly with the police, they use that as heuristic for making a judgment about police activity in that particular circumstance, because they don't know the full details. And of course, they're unlikely to ever know the full details. So that might be, I think some combination of all these things are going on to help explain why, in particular, social identification motivates support for the police use of force. I'm coming to the end now. One more example to see what we think about what's going on here. It's quite common in the procedural justice literature. The literature addresses this idea of procedural justice to suggest that when people think police behave in a procedurally fair way, when they grant legitimacy to the police, they're motivated, if you like, to empower the police. They're motivated to believe that the police should be given more power, should be enabled to make decisions as they see fit, to not be constrained too much by regulation, to not be governed too much by the law. You can also make the claim that granting legitimacy to an authority involves kind of directly ceding to it the right to decide what's the right thing to do, ceding to it the right to decide what is appropriate behaviour in a particular situation. So we asked survey respondents, do you think the government should increase the powers of the police, decrease the powers of the police, or keep the powers at the current level? So kind of reassuringly, in some sense, I think in the British context, 2/3 of people said it was kind of about right, don't give them any more power. But a quarter of people said the police should be given more power. And I have to tell you, the police in the UK have got a lot of power already. So giving them more power is not an entirely unproblematic idea. We also asked people, do you think the police should be more regulated, less regulated, or that regulation should be kept at about the same as the current level? Again, over half said about the same. Interestingly, 40% said they should be more regulated. So quite a number of people were saying they should be given more power and be more regulated. People have conflicting views about these things. Plug those into models as before, and what we found is that the legitimacy as normative alignment is consistently associated with thinking the police should be given more power and thinking that the police should be regulated less. Now, if I was a police officer, I'd think that was great. I want to be given more power, I want to be regulated less, and these judgments are based on people's assessment that I operated according to their own moral or normative framework. If I was a police officer, I think that's great. If I'm me, I think that's slightly problematic. I'm not sure that the police should be given more power, and I don't think they should be regulated less. But to the extent to which people grant police legitimacy, they're more motivated to believe these things about the police in the United Kingdom. Some associations elsewhere, particularly important here, I think, when you identified more strongly as a citizen, again, you thought the police should be given more power than they currently have. So, I think there's a significant tension, or paradox, really, here, actually, in that procedural justice and legitimacy both limit and enable police power. They both place a set of constraints about what the police do. They can't just do what they want. but they also create the space in which the police can, for example, use what looks to be inappropriate force. And social identity is an important element in this process. And I think this identity-legitimacy link, certainly in the context of the United Kingdom, may be one reason why the legitimacy of the police hasn't declined catastrophically or even that significantly over the last 30 years, despite this long history of revelations of police malpractice, corruption, violence, etc., etc. People continue to identify with the group the police represent. They continue to legitimise the police on that basis. Though that aspect, or that path, if you like, leading to legitimacy, is in some sense independent or distinct from their evaluations of what the police are actually doing. I might explain why the legitimacy of the police hasn't collapsed over the last 30, 40, 50 years. I think it's important to remember it's not all about social identity. So there's an evaluative aspect to procedural justice is also going to be in play, which is a bit like, just going back to here, there's a tension, there's a paradox here. People are making active evaluations of the police, holding them up against standard norms of fairness, fair process, but they're also relating to the police as representatives of a social group to which they feel they belong. And this really underlines, I think, and we kind of knew this, but it needs to be resaid often, the legitimacy is a dynamic process. Right? The legitimacy of the police, the nature of the relationship between the police is constantly changing, although having said that, it's marked by significant stability. So most people will just hold the police legitimacy, and that kind of legitimacy in the UK, and that kind of reproduces over time. But every so often, you're going to get a sudden rupture and change, as we saw, for example, in the riots of 2011. And I said I'd come back to these as an example. I don't know why that's doing that. I don't care if the police beat up fascists. In fact, I'm quite keen on the police beating up fascists. And the reason I think that's true is because I don't identify with fascists. They're an outgroup to me. I like it when the police are steaming in with batons and fascists. This march here, right, was the main reason. I don't know if you can see this. It says, "Fight the ban." And what they were demonstrating about was a ban on hunting with dogs, hunting wild animals with dogs, which is a certain section of the English upper class is very, very keen on doing and has been for hundreds and hundreds of years. The last Labour government moved to ban it, and in fact did ban it. This was a big demonstration that took place in London around that campaign. So basically these protesters here are not your normal protesters. These are not trades unionists. These are not students. These are rich people from the countryside who've come up to London to demonstrate. And what was really interesting about this march is these are people who previously had very, very positive relationships with the police because they came from a social class that didn't have problems with the police. They came from a social class where the police did things for them. All of a sudden, they were confronted with police officers who looked like this. They'd never seen that before. They'd never been confronted with police with batons drawn. Not long after this photo was started taken, they started hitting them with those batons because they weren't doing the thing they told. And what this, I think you can trace to this moment, actually, to this specific march, a change in the opinions of the police among particular sections of the English upper classes, or power elites, if you like, which was related to the idea that all of a sudden they realised that the police weren't always on their side. The police weren't always in their in-group. The police could be an out-group. The police could behave in procedurally, what they experienced in procedurally unfair ways. And this is actually still having repercussions today in terms, for example, of a way what is now a governing right-wing party thinks about the police. Because a few members of that party were confronted for the first time in their lives by police officers doing this. And again, I don't care if police are beating up toffs. I'm quite happy when the police are beating up toffs because I don't identify with toffs, right? And so this is the point I'm trying to make. My identity judgments are shaping the way that I judge police activity. In this case, I'm finding that activity much more acceptable here than I am here. And I will finish there. I don't know how long that was, but questions, comments, please.
Well, I would ask you about the situation of the refugees now in Europe and about this challenge of the police nowadays, because you have these huge situations of refugees. What do you think are the challenges of the police in UK and in Europe after this refugee?
Good question. I think that the main challenge to the police from that quote-unquote flood of refugees into Europe and much less into the UK actually, so I'm not really that qualified to talk. Doesn't come from the refugees and immigrants more broadly themselves. It comes from the reactions of the established population to the way that they think those groups should be policed. So we've done some work on trust and legitimacy of the British police among migrant or immigrant communities. And what we find actually is it's higher. So if you've migrated to the UK, you grant the police more trust and more legitimacy than if you were born in the UK. And there's some very good reasons for that. So for example, a lot of immigrants in the UK come from countries such as India, Pakistan, Nigeria. If you've come from those countries, the British police, they just are better than the police in the country. So you're inclined to trust them more. You're inclined to grant them more legitimacy because you're comparing them with the police in the country that you came from. They do quite well out of that comparison. So I don't think migration in and of itself is a problem until the police start making it a problem by treating those people unfairly. I think the immediate problem from that situation is going to arise from the established population wanting particular forms of policing against the out-group. So I don't think there's any doubt in my mind, and you can see this in kind of newspaper headlines and such like, that people want what they see to be illegal immigrants to be very heavily and aggressively policed. And they will, in some sense, reward the police for doing that. And that makes the job of the police more difficult because then they have to stand up to that and say, we're not going to do that, we're going to treat these people the same way we treat everyone else. And to be fair to the police in the UK, they don't do that perfectly, not by any stretch of the imagination, but they're quite good at resisting that kind of punitive urge towards people. In the long run, the problems that police have with immigrant communities are created by the police themselves. So you can almost trace the history of British immigration in terms of groups coming in, being badly policed, poor relationships with the police being established within those communities and then reproducing themselves over time. So you kind of think that in the long run that might be what's happened, but the police have changed, so perhaps they can resist it.
Would you say that if you treat immigrants in an unfair way and in a just way, you can produce more violence or more risk to the Europe, like this argument like this? If you deal with the flood of immigrants in a fair way, in a just procedural way, you can keep the situation better than if you treat it's an argument that
yeah, absolutely, and the police of many European countries are not doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think that's the way the police in Belgium and France, for example, have reacted to what's happened in those countries in the last couple of years. And you would definitely want to say that to the extent that the police treat incomers unfairly, you're going to create identity problems among those groups because they're feeling pushed out by this important authority figure of the country to which they've moved. You're going to create legitimacy problems. You're going to create low levels of cooperation with police in those communities, low levels of compliance, and then you kind of get this vicious circle. So you get low cooperation, low compliance, more aggressive policing, even less cooperation, even less compliance. So it's very easy to imagine how those kind of vicious circles can be established. And I think in that circumstance, the onus is on the police to get it right. The problems are created by the police, and the solutions will lie within the police, and otherwise to not do those things and behave in a different way. And I do think, certainly in Belgium and France, you can see the extent to which, I suspect this is true, the police haven't stood up to the external pressures and haven't said we're not going to treat these groups differently to anyone else. We are going to treat them differently, we are going to treat them unfairly, and with all the implications that flows from that.
Well, I thought it was very interesting, the idea of the mechanism of social identity, enabling and limiting the police. I just have a question concerning this idea of social identity. You use basically if you feel like a British citizen and if you feel like a British citizen, law-abiding citizen. How do other social variables work? How would these variables work in that model? Could you include variables such as race, ethnicity, social class, gender? Because maybe I have a bias from Brazil, but I would say that these social dimensions of society will have a very different attitude on police violence, for example.
Yeah, so several things to say there. So it's certainly the case that social identity isn't the only bridge, if you like, between procedural justice and legitimacy. I definitely think there's this kind of evaluative path that bypasses social identity. Procedural justice for the police definitely isn't the only thing that, if you like, affects people's identity judgments. So one important implication of that is that certainly in the British context, and that again is who knows what's going on elsewhere. It's an empirical question that we would need to consider. But certainly within the British context, I would argue, and I think there's some evidence to support this, that if other variables, social demographic variables, attitudinal variables, whatever, predict social identity, so if some groups or types of individuals identify more strongly, those groups or individuals are going to legitimise the police more, regardless of what the police have done, purely because they identify more strongly with the group that the police represent. Identity, ethnicity, race would be the classic kind of example of that. In the UK, and it's kind of a fortunate thing, I guess, almost everyone identifies as British and law-abiding citizen. And actually people from ethnic minorities identify more strongly as British than people from the white British majority population, for various reasons. I won't go over it. But you would certainly expect, for example, if we moved across the channel to France, in France, that's the very kind of ethno-national concept of national identity revolving around being white and French. And if you're a young Moroccan kid in the suburbs of Paris, you probably, it doesn't really work for you, and you've got a different kind of identity process. But that different kind of identity is going to correlate with your opinions of the police. So you've got this kind of oppositional identity going on there, and probably to the extent to which you identify with that group, you delegitimize the police purely as a result of identifying strongly with that group, because not least that group has been set up by relations with the police. So one of the reasons you identify as who knows how people identify, but one of the people feel they belong to these marginal social groups is because they've been pushed into those groups by police activity over a number of different years. So what it is, in a sense, to be a member of that group is to delegitimise the police. That's how you define yourself against the police. And you'll see that in parts of the UK as well. So certainly in parts of our Black Caribbean population, which is people whose history is in the Caribbean, they will define themselves as a member of a group in opposition to the police. So part of what it is to be Black British, in some sense, is to be not the police. So all these things are going to be going on at the same time. But I think identity is often going to be at the core of these kind of relationships. And again, I think the interesting point is, yes, some of those identities are going to be formed in relationship to police and on the basis of what police have done. Some of them are going to have really different and other sources and roots and processes working within them, but all might have some relationship with the police. It's just an empirical question of finding out which ones and what's the nature of that relationship. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Ben, I want to talk about something that is strange for us when we talk about the police, but it's very important for each police. The idea of consent, and what is the weight of consent in this identity? If you think that it means that I recognize myself in the police officer.
Good question. I think that people do recognise themselves in some implicit, kind of subconscious way. A lot of people do recognise themselves in the police. In other words, they do somehow sense or believe or experience the police as representing a group to which they feel they belong and they feel is important, and that the police are an authority of that group and therefore deserve their support and respect, etc., etc. I think that's probably still, bizarrely enough, in the 21st century, if you like, quite a strong current in public opinion. But that's not to say that other things aren't going on as well. So one of the things that I think lots of my colleagues back home would say is that policing by consent is a myth. So all the stuff I've been talking about today acts as a kind of a veneer or a gloss over the underlying relationship, which is a power relationship, which is basically, to go right back to the definition of police at the beginning, kind of Marcus Dubber's definition, the police can do anything they want to maintain order and restore normality, if you like. They're empowered to do whatever it takes. And if that's true, then consent is out the window. It doesn't matter if people consent to that relationship, because I think that's an extreme position. And within, I think it's possible to imagine particular political contexts in the UK, maybe one, where there is consent to that relationship, and the power of the police isn't unbounded in the sense that that says. So they can't just do what they want. And if they can't just do what they want, I think that relationship, then you start to see, well, it's founded on some kind of consent, some kind of positive relationship between police and public, because the consent can be withdrawn. And if people can withdraw their consent, if people in the UK withdrew their consent from the police in significant numbers, things really would change. There would actually be a process of change as a result of that. So where any particular country sits on that continuum, if you like, I think, again, it's an empirical question you'd have to find out. Does that make sense? Kind of.
I'd like to speak a little bit more about the paradox, about the procedural justice and the support for the use of force, both have an impact on legitimacy. Because the procedural justice means to act in fair ways, and support for the use of force, probably not acting in fair ways, but they both have an impact on legitimacy. So what those people are thinking when they're asking about the procedural justice, they are thinking only about themselves, and the others, they are like them, and that's only for them the procedural justice it's applying, and that's why the both could be in the same predicting legitimacy at the same time. Or how could this work? Because to me they look like the opposite ideas, and how they could both could be linked to legitimacy.
Yeah, I agree. And so I think the procedural justice for me and people like me is probably important. Okay. So when people answer those kind of questions, I think they're almost undoubtedly thinking about themselves and people like them, and they want policing like that for themselves and people like them. And to the extent they think they get it, you get legitimacy. I'm pretty sure that that's what's going on, and there is some evidence to suggest that's what's going on. But when they start thinking about other people, their judgments become much more fluid and much more context dependent, and much more dependent on their relationship with the person they're imagining encountering and dealing with the police. I think another way to think about this might be actually that it's not quite as much of a paradox as I was suggesting, because it may be so that these normative alignment is really, really heavily based on perceptions of procedural fairness, almost to the extent they clap to that, which they don't, but they almost do. That promotes support for police use of force when it seems acceptable. Right? It doesn't promote support for police use of force when it seems unacceptable. So it may actually be that procedural justice and legitimacy, that pathway, only promotes support for police use of force that is acceptable, that seems within appropriate bounds, if you like. And when police step beyond those bounds, people don't, that doesn't flow through, that support doesn't flow through to the unacceptable police use of force. When it comes to social identity, this, if you like, this correlation between social identity and support for unacceptable, what seems like unjustified police use of force, that may stem from aspects of social identity that aren't related to procedural justice. That may stem from aspects of social identity related to some other set of ideas or beliefs or processes or whatever it is that people use to form their identity judgment. And that may be where you start getting into some of the kind of problematic support for police views against others, but that might not actually be based in procedural justice. So one of the things we need to do with this in the future is start to unpack some of these ideas to see whether what I just said was right. And I kind of hope it is, because it would be less of a paradox and it would be less ethically challenging and problematic. Because one implication of what I've said so far might be that the police can act in procedurally fair ways in relationships to particular individuals, and then in some sense buy their support for use of force down the line against other people, or at least obfuscate that, or provide a cloak or something like that, and that would be problematic. Right, so we need to unpack some of these ideas to see what's really going on. And I suspect it's a lot more complicated than the way I just described it, that's for sure. But to go back to your first point, I think that's really important. Primarily when people answer these questions, they're thinking about me and people like me. And as soon as they start thinking about people who are not like me,
because
it becomes more complicated.
These scenarios, then they don't see themselves in the scenarios, and then they give power to the police to do whatever they want.
Yeah. Or something like that, yeah, exactly.
I would ask one more. I would like to ask you about for me, as a Brazilian, as a football fan, for me, one of the most successful victories of the police in UK was the victory against the hooligans, because in the 80s it was amazing the mess that they used to do in the soccer games, and after 10 years or 15 years they just stopped. And it was nowadays the soccer champion league of UK is the most successful in the world, maybe. They keep the order and this kind of things. Do you know how they do this? And what's about legitimacy in this kind of discussion?
Yeah, so they did it in two important ways, and I'm not an expert, so I wouldn't be able to tell you which was the more important and which was the. They did it first by some really just heavy-handed crackdowns on hooligans, and they really started to take seriously the policing of football matches, and use aggressive policing to control these guys. That happened, and that had an effect. I think they did also conversely make an effort to try and police football fans in a more procedurally fair way. So running alongside, or at least somehow in tandem, with this kind of aggressive crackdown kind of thing, was more of an effort to build relationships with football fans in ways that would look very familiar in terms of the procedural justice model. So, for example, just communicating better with fans, explaining to them what's going on at matches, all that kind of stuff. I suspect the crackdown bit came first and had the most effect, but then they realised that if they really wanted to solve the problem, they had to do other things as well. So police who police football matches in the UK have what they call football liaison officers, whose job it is to build relationships with the fans. So teams will have an attached football liaison officer, and that person will go, or a team even, and that person will go to every single match, talk to all the fans, use the fans to find out what's going on, build relationships with them, and that's the way it's policed at the moment. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good example of kind of where some of this stuff starts to get a bit uncomfortable for people like me, because I think probably the crackdown. There are also other reasons why football hooliganism declined that have nothing to do with policing of it, have to do with other social factors. But yeah, it's a complicated question.
I have a question. Do you think that the social media in UK is really a source of constraint for the police violence? Because here in Brazil, I have the impression that the social media sometimes inflates the support for use of violence by the police, like what happened yesterday. The deputy, congressman who spit in the face of the ex, but from other one from you
yeah,
saw
I know,
the
yeah,
case,
yeah.
yes. And what we see in social media in Brazil is that the country is tear apart, and we have two different views, and I think the social media sometimes inflates the support for this type of violence, and it's not the prophecy that we heard like 10 years ago that the social media will make everything transparent, and then everyone will reflect, and it's not television anymore with just one vision, everyone will think about it. No, it looks even worse, I think. So in England the social media really works for that or not, or is the same as Brazil?
It's really good question. So another example would be United States, and how many hundreds of times they've shot unarmed innocent people, many of which have been captured on mobile phone footage, etc., etc. And you can think about the way that people react to that footage. And to a large extent, the people who are already suspicious of the police have their suspicions confirmed. The people who are supportive of the police just discount it and say, well, look, he had it coming, or of course the police officer did that, what else was he supposed to do? So obviously people are always going to be applying their kind of ideological filters to whatever reporting of the police from whatever source. And I'm sure that's the same in the UK as well. I think the reason why I think it might constrain the police, certainly in the short to medium term, is because the police think it will. So they're really quite aware that things in the past they were doing when no one was watching, now people are watching. And that probably has had some effects on their behaviour. So when they're being filmed in the street, I suspect and I think there is some evidence to support this, that they're slower to escalate disputes. So instead of, if someone's arguing with them, instead of switching straight to an enforcement mode which may involve force, they'll take longer to get there by trying to defuse that situation verbally or however, because they're aware they're being filmed. So in a sense they have to be more careful. So one interesting implication of what you just said, and who knows what will happen, is that effect might wear off over time. But when they're used to being filmed all the time, and when nothing really changes as a result of the times where it gets out that they have done something wrong, perhaps this will just move into the background and any effect will diminish over time. I don't think we were far enough along that process to find out. But I think your basic point is absolutely sound. Because the ideological filters that people have are so strong when it comes to the police, they'll just interpret this material that may be flooding out in a way that it wasn't in the past. They'll just interpret this in line with their ideological preferences or biases or stereotypes. And that isn't going to change based on the volume of the material, I think. Yeah.
Thank you
That's
very
it?
much.
Okay.
Really nice.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks for listening.